Hello, and welcome to this very special episode of Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. It's that time of year again, when the days are a bit shorter, the nights are that little bit too long, and every shadow hides something sinister. It's time for the Halloween special. Every year I bring you 3 spine-tingling poems and indulge in a little bit of melodrama to explain them. This year is no different. In this episode, you'll hear 3 poems from 3 fantastic poets, Emily Dickinson, Linda Pastan, and Lord Alfred Tennyson. In One Need Not Be a Chamber, you'll learn that all that is sinister isn't supernatural. In the Deathwatch Beetle, you'll bear witness to a poetic unraveling of a psyche. To round it all out, we'll be taking a look at the supposed inspiration behind the Cthulhu mythos in the Kraken. So, without further ado, let's dive into One Need Not Be a Chamber by Emily Dickinson. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. Far safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, than an interior confronting that whiter host. Far safer through an abbey gallop, the stones a chase, than, moonless, one's own self-encounter in a lonesome place. Ourself behind, ourself concealed, should startle most. Assassin, hid in our apartment, be horror's least. The prudent carries a revolver, he bolts the door, o'erlooking a superior spectre, more near. Before I begin the analysis, I would like to thank Carolyn Hembry, who brought this to my attention on Twitter. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's difficult to put into words the impact that Emily Dickinson has had both on poetry and on English literature as a whole. She only reached literary acclaim after her death, with her first collection being published 4 years after her passing. She became well known for her acute observations on both the natural world and the minutiae of everyday life. These skills were honed over the course of her education and later sharpened to an extreme point by her own struggles with religion and science. The poet emerged firmly in the camp of the latter in the later years of her life. All this skill is brought to bear in One Need Not Be a Chamber. In the poem, Dickinson constructs an eerie parallel between the human mind, inner demons, and that most gothic of tropes, the haunted house. Whilst the transformation of old Victorian houses into the default horror homestead would come later than her time, the American Gothic genre came into full swing during Dickinson's lifetime, with the poet herself becoming a key contributor. Looking at this poem, it's not hard to see why. From the very first line, we understand that the subject of the poem is a haunting. Dickinson explains that the human mind can be far more labyrinthine than any mere building, with corridors surpassing a material place, as she puts it. In the second stanza, she exposes the true peril of inner turmoil, expressing how much better it would be to receive an actual supernatural manifestation than to struggle with your own inner demons for even a moment. Far safer of a midnight meeting, external ghost, than an interior confronting that whiter host. This stanza is written in the style that would become synonymous with Dickinson. Firstly, it is concise, as are all the other stanzas here. Dickinson was able to create a comprehensive set of images that would ensnare the reader with an economy of words that is, even by contemporary standards, remarkable. That cohesion and fullness of image was aided by the musicality of her verse, which would carry the reader through it with ease. She achieved this in 2 ways: unique but consistent structure, and slant rhyme. Throughout her body of work, Emily Dickinson employed a wide range of styles and structures, constantly finding new ways to express her inner world. But, whilst often utilising unique forms, she would maintain the chosen structure for each poem rigorously throughout. She was not a huge fan of iambic pentameter, but instead favoured iambic tetrameter, 4 metrical feet. Whilst this is one core characteristic of her work, it is her use of rhyme that often makes it hers uniquely. Her favourite rhyme scheme was ABCB, which is on display here. Meeting and confronting have no direct rhyme, whilst ghost and host are a perfect match. She would bridge the lack of direct rhyme using slant rhyme, otherwise known as partial rhyme. The ing of the first and third line provides that. Meeting, confronting. Dickinson continues to recount her encyclopedia of Gothic tropes in the next stanza, comparing more classic horror situations to the far riskier prospect of introspection. Far safer through an abbey gallop, the stones a chase, than, moonless, one's own self-encounter in lonesome place. The Gothic setting of an old church, with some grim being in pursuit, is, for Dickinson's speaker, far preferable to even a glimpse of their own thoughts. You may notice the unusual use of punctuation when you read the poem, pauses when they are not needed, and capitalizations in unusual places. Here, the intermittent grammar is used to create a sense of hesitation, a trepidation on the part of the speaker to continue. But continue they must, and in the next stanza, the true spectre of the piece is revealed. Our self, behind our self concealed, should startle most. Assassin hid in our apartment, be horror's least. So, according to the speaker, the true enemy is yourself, a far more daunting foe than some meagre assassin who only means to end our lives. There is a beautiful sense of irony in all these stanzas. More often than not, the things that Dickinson is contrasting her dark night of the soul with represent a far greater threat. Her images have a wonderful sense of continuity and consistency once again, as the second and fourth lines start and complete a scale of fear, from horror's most to horror's least. The final stanza of the poem is a recognition that preparation does not always prevent disaster. The prudent carries a revolver, he bolts the door, o'erlooking a superior spectre, more near. No revolver or strong lock can keep you safe from your inner demons, and no amount of precaution can protect you from the way your inner demons will haunt you. I absolutely love this poem. I find its tone to be almost postmodernist in the way that it plays with the tropes and conventions of the Gothic genre. At every point, Dickinson subverts her readers' expectations of the supernatural with the altogether more modern concern of mental health and conscience. In that way, I think it does an incredible job of showcasing just how unique Dickinson was as a poet of her time, and just why her legacy has endured since her death. Speaking of death, our next poem is one that also takes stock of the human soul and psyche. This time, what happens to the soul in the wake of tragedy. This is the Deathwatch Beetle by Linda Pastan. A cardinal hurls itself at my window all morning long, trying so hard to penetrate its own reflection, I almost let it in myself. Though once I saw another red bird, crazed by the walls of a room, spatter its feathers all over the house. My whole childhood is coming apart. The last stitches about to be ripped out with your death, and I will be left ridiculous to write condolence letters to myself. The Deathwatch Beetle earned its name not from its ugliness or our terror of insects, but simply because of the sound it makes, ticking. When your spirit perfects itself, will it escape out of a nostril, or through the spiral passage of an ear, or is it even now battering against your thin skull, wild to get through, blood brother, to this crimson bird? I'm fascinated by the construction of this poem. Each stanza a tiny vignette of terror, with a single tragic theme tying it all together. Linda Pastan was a poet who wrote relentlessly about the ordinary, but with an oddly sinister focus. Here is a quote from the poet, from her interview with the Paris Review. I am indeed interested, you might say obsessed, not with ordinary life per se, but with the dangers lurking just beneath its seemingly placid surface. One of those dangers being loss itself. Death, of course, is the ultimate danger, the ultimate loss. As I move closer to it, I write about it more frequently, and perhaps more feelingly. Though I recently came upon some poems I wrote when I was 12. And they, too, are about death. A more fitting quote for a Halloween special I simply cannot fathom. This poem is a testament to Pastan's focus and attention to detail when it comes to death and grief. Each stanza, as I said, is a vignette of terror. Each one focuses on a unique aspect of death. The first stanza emphasizes the senselessness of it. A cardinal hurls itself at my window all morning long. Trying so hard to penetrate its own reflection, I almost let it in myself. Though once I saw another red bird, crazed by the walls of a room, spatter its feathers all over the house. There is something instantly macabre in this image of a death wish-script cardinal. The animal itself is crimson, that most ubiquitous of horror colours, being synonymous with blood. The true horror of this bird, though, lies in its repeated smashing against a window. For me, this feels an instant reference to Edgar Allan Poe, who frequently wrote about sinister repetition of a single action, often driving his protagonists to insanity. The speaker in this poem is driven to a point of crazed compassion, considering letting the creature in. We are then met with the horrific revelation that our speaker has seen such a thing before, and it ended in feathers all over the house. The use of the word spatter is very intentional here, meant to invoke the idea of blood yet again. The metaphor of the crimson bird as a harbinger of death is a masterful one, and no one had mastered the art of the contemporary dark metaphor quite like Linda Pastan. The relentless little bird is a stand-in for the inevitability of that most grim process that we all must experience. It is always there and will not be denied. However, our speaker is also familiar with the chaos that it leaves in its wake, as so many of us unfortunately are. From there, the second stanza shifts its focus to a new scene. My whole childhood is coming apart. The last stitch is about to be ripped out with your death, and I will be left, ridiculous, to write condolence letters to myself. In this stanza, we are given a hint as to who is dying in this particular poem. My whole childhood is coming apart is a hint that Pastan is about to lose a parent, or at least a parental figure. The image is once again macabre in the extreme, with stitches being ripped, an odd invocation of a wound reopening, or simply an unraveling. The loneliness of grief is given heavy emphasis in the phrase, and I will be left, ridiculous, to write condolence letters to myself. This then is a kind of pre-elegy poem to someone who is yet to die, leaving the speaker with their looming passing and subsequent red bird waiting to spatter itself. The third stanza sees the eponymous Deathwatch Beetle make its appearance, and the poetic imagery makes a strong return. The Deathwatch Beetle earned its name not from its ugliness or our terror of insects, but simply because of the sound it makes ticking. Here, Pastan provides us with a rather matter-of-fact poetic description of how the Deathwatch Beetle did in fact get its name. It's not a sentry of the dying, but rather a timepiece counting down to something. The horror here can be better understood in the context of the previous two stanzas. Pastan is waiting for someone to die, and their dread of that moment makes each tick of the clock unbearable. How did this beetle's ticking become associated with death then? In my research for this episode, I found a fascinating account from naturalist Thomas Brown, who had undertaken writing a manual of common errors called Pseudodoxia Epidemica. Here is his entry on the Deathwatch Beetle. Few ears have escaped the noise of the dead watch, that is, the little clicking sound heard often in many rooms, somewhat resembling that of a watch. and this is conceived to be of an evil omen or prediction of some person's death, wherein, notwithstanding, there is nothing of rational presage, or just cause of terror unto melancholy and meticulous heads. For this noise is made by the little sheath-winged grey insect found often in wainscot, benches and woodwork in the summer. We have taken many thereof, and kept them in thin boxes, wherein I have heard and seen them work and knack with a little proboscis or trunk against the side of the box, like a picus mauritius or woodpecker against a tree. He that could extinguish the terrifying apprehensions hereof might prevent the passions of the heart and many cold sweats in grandmothers and nurses, who, in the sickness of children, are so startled with these noises. In other words, coincidence is a terrible thing. It is also rumoured that this very same beetle influenced Edgar Allan Poe to write the Tell-Tale Heart. So far in the poem we have seen the inevitability of death, the chaos of it, and the anticipation of it. The fourth stanza reveals a final aspect. When your spirit perfects itself, will it escape out of a nostril, or through the spiral passage of an ear, or is it even now battering against your thin skull? Wild to get through, blood brother to this crimson bird. The crimson bird returns as Pastan contemplates the form their soul might take upon departure, a further clue that this person, whomever is dying, may be sick or unresponsive, only adding to the frustration our speaker feels. They contemplate the various escape routes a soul might use, only to settle on the disturbing image established in the first stanza, now battering against your thin skull, wild to get through. Our poet imagines that the relative wants nothing but release from the tyranny of sickness, and is desperate for the relief of death. And so the fourth aspect is revealed, a strange kind of relief. It may grant a suffering person release from their pain, if not the living they leave behind. I stumbled upon this poem quite by accident and have been obsessed with it ever since. While I think the subject is very dark, I also think that Pastan's gorgeous writing and beautiful imagery elevate it to something beyond a miserable contemplation of the Grim Reaper. When she was alive, Pastan was often asked why she wrote on such dark and hopeless things. As a poet should, she penned a poem in response. Here is her reading of that at the Dodge Poetry Festival.
Why are your poems so dark? Isn't the moon dark too most of the time? And doesn't the white page seem unfinished without the dark stain of alphabets? When God demanded light, he didn't banish darkness. Instead, he invented ebony and crows and that small mole on your left cheekbone. Or did you mean to ask, why are you sad so often? Ask the moon. Ask what it has witnessed.
Before we continue, I have a favour to ask. If you've been enjoying this particularly spooky edition of the podcast, or if you're a regular listener, please consider leaving it a review wherever you listen. Just a star rating will do, as it really does help to get the podcast out to more people. If you know someone who'd enjoy the horrors of this episode, please consider sending it to them directly. With that being said, on with the show. Our final poem for this Halloween episode is The Kraken by Lord Alfred Tennyson, a poem whose horrific vision of a beast would go on to inspire an entire multiverse of terror and woe. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, his ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep, the Kraken sleepeth, faint as sunlights flee. About his shadowy sides above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light, from many a wondrous grot and secret cell, unnumbered and enormous polypi winnow with giant arms the slumbering green, where hath he lain for ages and will lie, battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. Reading this, it's not difficult to see how it would have influenced H.P. Lovecraft's now infamous Cthulhu mythos, but the poem is far more than just inspiration for another work. Lord Tennyson is today widely regarded as one of the most popular Victorian poets. He was an incredibly structured poet, very keen to invoke the correct forms in his work. This poem actually uses a variation on the Petrarchan sonnet to give it form. The Petrarchan sonnet is a poem consisting of 14 lines divided into two parts, an octave and a sestet. The keen-eyed observer among you will realise that there are 7 lines in the final section of the poem as opposed to 6, hence why I called it a variation. Despite his love of strict form, his themes, on the other hand, could be wild and varied. This apocalyptic vision has stirred wild conjecture from critics, as the imagery and central subject of the poem is so open. Some critics believe it to be a work of politics, the slumbering beast being the working classes, whose inevitable revolution would bring about the end of civilization and the working classes themselves. Rise and on the surface die. Tennyson was a conservative. Can you tell? Others wrote that the poem was meant to represent repressed fear and the depths of psyche, the Kraken being the unconscious, surging forward to disrupt the passive life a person has been living, their more bestial nature being revealed over time. Regardless of its core meaning, it is the image Tennyson paints that I find most intriguing. It is a poem that comes early in the esteemed poet's career, but as the critic John D. Rosenberg wrote, this poem holds the germ of all Tennyson's poetry. The poet stakes out his essential subject, the twilight world of myth, in which consciousness and unconsciousness intersect. Tennyson is writing on a truly epic, mythological scale here. All we need do is look at the opening octave. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, his ancient dreamless uninvaded sleep, the Kraken sleepeth, faintest sunlights flee. About his shadowy sides above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light form many a wondrous grot and secret cell. This is truly language of doom and gloom. From thunders to abysmal seas and places where the sunlight flees, Tennyson is taking us to the deepest point of the ocean where no person has managed to venture in his time. The poet creates a haunted place where we as readers do not necessarily wish to go. The opening octave does not follow the traditional rhyming scheme of the Petrarchan sonnet, which is A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. Instead, Tennyson opts for a classic A, B, A, B scheme. A is defined by the first line and deep, so sleep in the third line corresponds. However, Tennyson returns to the traditional technique in the second set of 4. Here it is A, B, B, A, swell being the A, cell corresponding, height being the B, with light corresponding. This unusual approach may be done for a few different reasons. The Victorian audience would have been familiar with the structure of any sonnet, Petrarchan or not. In slightly changing the rhyme scheme, he may draw the reader in. In returning through the traditional scheme, he then creates a lulling sense of familiarity, an initial fright, followed by the familiar. All this comes to shape the poem in an almost prophetic way, with some people claiming that the language is Delphic in nature, an oracle of something grand and terrifying. This is fitting given that Tennyson was preoccupied with, as Rosenberg put it, the twilight world of myth. It also shows the astuteness of the young Tennyson in understanding what got the Victorian public excited. During the Victorian era, there was an absolute craze for all things sea monster, with the Times newspaper of the time stating, it was long since discovered that nothing is so fascinating to an English crowd as a sea monster. This craze coincided with the rise of Darwin and his theory of evolution, which in turn led to an increase in scientific exploration and classification of animal life. All this stirred Tennyson's own imagination, and we can see hints of Darwin's theories in phrases like millennial growth and height. There is more evidence of scientific language in the final 7 lines of the poem. Unnumbered and enormous polypi winnow with great arms the slumbering green. There hath he lain for ages, and will lie, battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. These are truly apocalyptic visions of his Kraken. The latter fire being the fire of the end times, further signified by the fact that angels will watch its rise from the deep. The Kraken is described as polypi, the Victorian term that encompassed all things with tentacles, octopi, squid, and cephalopods, and any other creature that might fit the description. The scale of Tennyson's Kraken is made clear in his description of its giant arms. The ancient nature of it is highlighted by the phrase, lain for ages. Then comes its inevitable awakening, when, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. It will mean the end for it, and possibly for us too. These harrowing lines are surely the ones that could take root in the imagination of a young H.P. Lovecraft, the creator of the Cthulhu mythos. Another ancient being with an octopus-like visage. Those giant arms, terrifying tentacles, would become a defining trait of all his fiction, and indeed all the stories that would spring forth from his canon. Indeed, we know that Lovecraft was somewhat obsessed with Tennyson in his youth. As academic Richard Maxwell writes, H.P. Lovecraft also connected knowledge of the Kraken with knowledge of the cosmos, but he made the link in quite a different manner. As a young child between 3 and 7 years old, Lovecraft would spout Tennyson from the tabletop. We may never know the true meaning of Tennyson's poem. The Kraken was published in his early collection, Poems Chiefly Lyrical, and then he dropped from all future collections. It's unclear whether he was ashamed of this poem or felt that it no longer represented his writing. But perhaps, just maybe, like the rest of us, he came to fear it too. That is all for the 2023 Words That Burn Halloween special. I hope you are now suitably shaking in your boots. I want to give a massive thank you to everyone who suggested poems for this year's special. Rest assured, if you didn't hear your pick, it may well be on the chopping block for next year. Did you have a favourite poem? If so, I'd love to hear what it was. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there are a few ways you can do so. You can reach me directly by email at wordsthatburnpodcast@gmail.com. You can get in touch through the Words That Burn website, www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com. I'm on Twitter @WordsThatBurn. I'm on Instagram @WordsThatBurnPodcast, and on TikTok @WordsThatBurn2. If you'd like to read the script for this podcast, complete with citations and sources, and I really recommend you do, there was some fascinating research that went into this one, check out the Substack link in the description. As I said previously, if you enjoyed the episode or know someone who might, consider sending it to them directly, or just leave me a review wherever you listen. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy. Thank you once again for taking the time to listen to the podcast, and I wish you a truly terrifying Halloween, or, as we say here in Ireland, Iha Hauna Huna.